Good morning. Good morning. This is Saturday, February 17, 2024. And here we are at Career Services, where our goal is simple but important, but urgent. Simple but urgent. It's to help you on your journey from point A to point B, from where you are to someplace better, someday Isle to Successlandia, etc., etc. And good morning, what a bevy. Looks like a blue head with a cough coming out. Is that right? Is that how you feel? Blue head. Okay, so here we are once again, part of our daily routine. Whatever time of the day it is for you should be part of your routine. Try to do it at the same time every day. Now a cat crying cat. So you should do this routine, create this routine, same time every day. Repetition, repetition, repetition creates routine. Routine creates habits. Habits do what? Habits replace other habits. And if you have a good habit, slightly better replacing, you will progress through life. So that's how we do it. Today, though, is G.school, Grace School, God School, whatever. It's not B school, it's not D school, it's G school. And in our program is a 4-part transformational program that focuses on the 4 essential aspects: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. During the week, we focus on these 3: physical, mental, and emotional. Weekends is the spiritual, which is the most important part. So should we get right into it? Because I have a busy day today. Today is a 6-hour class in restorative justice, trauma in a broken world, healing. What is it called? Healing trauma in a broken world. And so these were the 2 books to read this week: Racial Healing, Trauma Healing. Oops. Racial Healing, Trauma Healing. That's kind of interesting, watching them on the screen. And having to write a paper. And my instructor's comment was, dot, 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 and some other things, positive, where in law school would be not compelling argument, or just not compelling. Okay, well, it's kind of hard in 600 words to really get a point across, but that means it needs to be smaller point I'm trying to make, and it was actually, I think, too broad. So let me try to break it down. There is a movement coming to the table, STARS, CJP, to overcome trauma. This isn't like personal trauma. This is community or societal trauma. Like from slavery. How do we overcome that? And the idea is, well, why don't we get the people together, the descendants of the slave owners and the descendants of the slaves will come to the table and we'll talk about it. And by talking about it, good things will occur. But my thing is, it's a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope because we're talking about descendants of slaves and descendants of slave owners, people who were not affected directly by the event. They're only affected by their beliefs about the event. So there's guilt on the part of the heirs of the slave owners. And there's anger and frustration on the part of the people who were slaves. Slippery slope. So I talked about cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. If you believe there is trauma and you believe there is harm, your cognitive dissonance is going to kick in, and you're going to try to make sense of that, right? And then you're going to have an idea. And to mention there are more slaves. Oh, yeah. Okay, well, we'll talk about that too. But your cognitive dissonance kicks in. I got to make sense of what's going on. You come up with an idea. Oh, let's sit around the table and talk, and we can overcome trauma. And you sit around the table and you talk and you feel better. Confirmation bias sets in. So now you see the world that there's trauma out there from generations past that needs to be corrected, and you see the solution as sitting around the table talking about it. Horizontal learning. Okay, so one of the problems is no one is there with discernment. No one is there to say, hey guys, wait a second. Is that actually true? Is it actually valid to say you should feel guilty because your ancestors were slave owners, that you should feel guilty? Well, once again, cognitive dissonance sets in, and you say, well, I've had privilege because they were slave owners. And then the question comes back, well, what about before they were slave owners? What about their ancestry? What about this? What about that? And then the whole thing gets too complicated and it starts breaking down. So, but the point is cognitive dissonance, new idea, confirmation bias. If there isn't a mechanism out there for discernment, hey guys, let's reel it in. That's not true. That's not necessarily true. Maybe there's another way to look at it. It's easy to spin off into a thing where it's us and them, because that's the conclusion of this. There is us and them. If we sit down together, we can overcome the us and them horizontally, not vertically. Horizontally, we can overcome it. Now, Wadham Bevy makes a point and then says, oops, sorry to interrupt. Feeling better does not equal healing. Aha, good point. Feeling better does not equal healing. Right. You can have somebody who's bleeding out, but you give them morphine, they're going to feel better, but they're not healing. Good point. That's a key thing to remember. Okay, so if somebody says, okay, well, it's easy to throw stones at an idea, man. It's easy to do that. That's the reefer. It's easy to do that. What do you have? Well, I would say we need to have vertical learning, not have a bunch of victims. So this is victims of the slave owners. They're the slave owners. The heirs of the slave owners are victims of the behavior of the slave owners. And the slaves, of course, are victims too of the way they're treated. Okay, so we need to have vertical learning, not vertical thing, not just horizontal. Number one, how do we do that? Well, I would say we start from the proposition that there is a creator to the universe. The universe was created. There is a creator, a God, right? Because if we're just atoms in the void, it doesn't matter. Trauma, it doesn't, it's, as Jordan Peterson says, or actually Frank Turek, I think, talks about, if there's no God, then what does anything matter? So what? You suffered trauma, so what? Survival of the fittest, the law of power. Fairness only occurs between equals. Weak suffer what they must. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. There's no moral, your morals are no more valid than anybody else's morals. You can believe whatever you want to believe, but it doesn't make it right. It's not right if we're just atoms in the void. They're just, everything's an opinion. It's all subjective. But if you start with the creator and you put certain things on the creator based upon our observations of the world, like there is good, there is beauty, things like that. Okay, great. So there's a creator. Now what? Well, what about suffering? Aha. So in the description down below, there will be a link to a chat GPT. Well, okay, I know chat GPT isn't perfect, but it was quick and easy and actually pretty good. There's a chat GPT thing on what do major religions say about suffering. What do they say about suffering? So I'm going to pull that over here right now, and I'll tell you what major religions say about suffering. Buddhism. Central to Buddhism is the concept of suffering, dukkha, which is seen as an inherent part of existence. The Four Noble Truths outline the nature of suffering, its causes, its cessation, and the path to its cessation, the Eightfold Path. Christianity views suffering as part of the human condition, often tied to the concept of original sin. Jesus' suffering and crucifixion are central to Christian theology. Islam. In Islam, suffering is seen as a test from Allah, designed to purify believers and strengthen their faith. Hinduism acknowledges suffering as part of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, samsara. It attributes suffering to karma, the consequence of past actions, and teaches that through dharma, righteous living, spiritual practices, one can overcome suffering and attain liberation. Moksha. Judaism sees suffering as a mystery and often emphasizes the importance of faith and trust in God during times of suffering. Sikhism teaches that suffering is a result of attachment to the material world and the ego through devotion to God, selfless service, and living according blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what does that mean? You're not going to get rid of suffering, therefore you're not going to get rid of trauma. So instead of having things sitting around saying, how can we eliminate trauma? A better approach would be to accept it as part of life. It is part of life, and we need to use it to make us better. They all almost sound the same. Yes, correct, they do. Suffering is part of life. As Jordan Peterson says, the symbol of Christianity is a guy nailed to a cross. Suffering, work to overcome it. Don't try to say, well, if we treat each other better, we're going to have a more just world. It's very naive to believe that there is a way that we can eliminate suffering. Now, the problem is, again, to me, confirmation bias sets in. If you believe there's suffering, trauma, community trauma from the past, if you see the world as nothing but trauma, and you're out there trying to fix it, and you convince people, yeah, there's trauma everywhere, trauma, everybody becomes a victim, or everybody becomes a villain. Whereas what Jesus teaches is that we should all be one. We should be one. Not come together to talk about our disputes, to figure out what is fair, not a restorative justice thing, but a compassion thing. Vertical learning. Start with, okay, guys, there's a creator, and here is the world. Suffering is part of it. There will always be trauma. Now, in the world, is there a system where it works, where people accept suffering as it is and they just keep moving on? Yes. I would say historically, people who are Christians, that is part of it. And then liberation theology came along to say, no, it doesn't need to be part of it. It can be better. But let's go back to, is there somewhere in the world? And if you look at the caste system, if you are an untouchable, you're supposed to accept your karma. You are an untouchable because of something you did in a previous life. You need to work through that. not sit down with the people who are in higher castes, the four higher castes, not to sit down with those people and say, look, can't we just get along? You need to apologize because you are oppressing me. You're treating me unfairly. You're treating me as an untouchable. That's not fair. The TV series Jesus the Game Changer, season 2, starts talking about the world in which Jesus was born and why Christianity flourished. And one of the arguments of why it flourished so well was because the Roman world was so stratified and so tough that when something came along that said, love one another as I have loved you, help each other, it caught on. People got this concept or started acting out a thing of, if I help you and you help me, we're going to be better off, rather than might makes right, rather than survival of the fittest, dog eat dog, kill or be killed. That was kind of the world at that time as civilizations were developing, were starting to develop. The law of conquest was the predominant thing. It was kill or be killed in much of the world. And si vis pacem parabellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. You need to have a strong army, because if we build up what we have and we can't defend it, somebody will take it from us. What is the history of the Israelites? Right? Conquered, taken into captivity, treated as slaves. Why? Because they couldn't stop it. They weren't invited to become slaves in Egypt or Babylon. They were taken as slaves. They were conquered and they were taken. Why? Because they couldn't keep what they had. Okay, so we're at 1721 in. This is just kind of a prep for today. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of a dialogue there. Our classes generally aren't that way, though. They're more of, here's my opinion, the instructor says her thing. The instructor says her thing, and then somebody else talks, and the instructor says something. There's not a lot of intergroup talking, but that maybe it's because it's on Zoom. So anyway, this is something to ponder: trauma and suffering in the world. I invite you to look at the ChatGPT thing about suffering, and I think if we accept that suffering is part of it, and I would say suffering is part of it because we have free will, that the Creator experiences hyper vicariously experiences life through us. And the free will is we get to do what we want to do. If we go out doing bad things, it's not really going to be a fulfilling life. Might be a brightly short and bright burning flame, as opposed to a flame that replicates what the Creator did, which was create the universe, create life, create all of this stuff. And it would seem that if the Creator is living hyper vicariously in its creations, that it would prefer the creations to also create, not to destroy. So to nurture, the kingdom of God is within us, and our goal is to nurture and share that in a positive way. Because there's one thing an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent God cannot do, is experience your existence until you exist. And another thing I learned today is he can't force you to love him. Aha! Ha. Okay, so with that, we're going to say and cut. What a baby! Hope to talk to you today. I'm going to be going to Starbucks. My class starts at 9, 6 hours on Zoom, 9 o'clock. That looks like a blue happy frog face. And with that, we'll say Auf Wiedersehen and cut and cut.